Alright guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about how severely wounded or sevs work, and also some changes to the current meta, some assumptions people have that probably aren't true, and hopefully we can update how we view some of these things in Rise of Kingdoms. Alright, so before I begin, I just want to say nobody, well, I'm sure there's people that know, but it's not an officially published thing where like we actually know the formula that Lilith uses to calculate this stuff. Most of this is just speculation, doing testing, and then formulating our own theory, but it's not something officially released by Lilith. Okay, so to figure out some of the stuff I figured out, we had to do tests, basically running marches, right? Baseline test here on the screen on the left you see here, I basically took two of my farms and made it so they're buffed, so they're same. So when I ran the marches, this is just to show 1000 T1, 1000 T1, they would do the same amount of damage at every turn, and they actually would both sad face at the same time, just to show that the conditions are equal, because you know the scientific process, the goal is to isolate an independent variable so you could test that while you keep all the other variables the same, right? So this is probably the easiest way to do it. This formula right here on the top right, I showed it in a couple of videos ago. This is courtesy of Wick Gaming. This guy, I want to give him credit again. He somehow figured out a formula where it shows a relationship between attack, defense, health, and the number of troops. Now he did say in his video that this formula worked up to 35,000 troops, and then at 35,000, Lilith has some kind of scaling mechanism where they actually up the damage so the fights don't last too long, right? So he actually couldn't figure that out, and I actually also encountered a scaling mechanism when it comes to sev wounds that I couldn't figure out. But just know, like in general, this is just a formula showing the relationship. Or another way to think about it, your combination of the amount of troops you bring out, your commanders, your equipment, your armaments, that's all going to funnel into this formula, and it's going to spit out two numbers when you fight someone. The amount of damage you take that turn, the amount of damage the enemy takes that turn, right? Now, sev wounds, if you look at a report, you'll see there's severely wounded and then slightly wounded, right? So every turn, you're going to take an amount of damage, and then there's going to be a percentage of that damage that's a sev wound. Right, so for example, if you took 100 damage that turn, there's going to be a percentage. So let's just say it's 12%, and that means 12 of that damage is going to go to severely wounded. So you're going to take 12 sev wounds, and then the other 88 is going to be slightly wounded, right? You don't have the troop on the field anymore, but that actually doesn't go to your hospital, right? So usually when we're looking at reports, what we're looking at is how you trade with the sev wounds, and that also shows up in the KP or the kill points. Okay, so right here you can see like the total here from the baseline test, right? This is all of the turns combined. We started out with 1,000 units, we ended up at 0. 872 of those just go off the field, but not to the hospital. 128 were sev wounds, so the sev wound percent is 12.8. Okay, this concept is really important, because as I talk about this more and more, a lot of what I'm talking about is the sev wound percentage, whereas this one up here, this formula up here, is just determined by your commanders, how many troops you bring out, your equipment and armaments, which, you know, obviously those affect the sev wounds, but that's not the percentage I'm talking about. Okay, so let's actually go over some common assumptions in Rise of Kingdoms, right? And I'll start with the first one, because this was actually my hypothesis coming into this video. We're doing the testing. It's that the sev wounds, the percentage, is actually a result of the health bar you have left when you take damage, right? So you know when you're fighting someone, you start out and there's actually no health bar, then it goes to green, then at a certain point it's around like 70% it goes to yellow, and then like when it gets down to like, I don't know, what is it, like 30, something around there, then it turns red, right? Then it goes to 0. So there's actually a color. And my hypothesis was the turn when you take damage, so let's just say you were at yellow and you take damage that turn, it corresponds to some kind of multiple or factor that determines the 7 wound percentage when you take damage at the turn. Right now, there's a very easy way to test it. I essentially took 2 marches, did 1,000 units each, and then I pulled away right around, when it got to yellow. So this one I pulled away when it was at 354, right? Then I refreshed this first march, brought it back so it's at 1,000 again. So this march is at yellow at 354 units, or 35.4% of the troops remaining, and then the fresh march is out there, right? And then this one, I had one march I brought out that had 1,000 units. The other one, I brought out a fresh march at 354 units. So this one is at 100% or green, right? We're actually more than green, because if you don't take any damage, it doesn't show up. This one is at yellow. And then I ran the report. So you could go into the turns and everything, but the numbers actually showed out completely the same, right? So you can see right here, the starting unit's the same, even though one is in yellow, one is in green. The amount of 7 wounds you take, the amount of slightly wounded, it's all the same. So what that actually shows is that the 7 wounds you take is actually not affected by the health bar color. That's probably the biggest I don't want to call it misinformation, because it sounds like conspiracy theory, right? But it's basically the biggest misperception out there. It actually has nothing to do with the color of the health bar. And I'll talk a little bit later into why I think that theory came to be. It literally is just the amount of troops the two marches have relative to each other. I think this test definitively proves that, because all of my future hypothesis is actually based off of debunking this health thing. All right. Common assumption in rock number 2, more normal and counterattack causes more 7 wounds. I call it the Attilla Takeda effect, just because even now, right, I think people think Attilla Takeda is a good 7 wound farming march, and then the logical assumption is because they have high attack and counterattack, that's why they cause more 7 wounds, right? So an easy way to test that is I take the same thing from before, and then I just give them both an attack boost, right? So I don't know if you can see on here, but here you can see that the damage output is actually higher. So what that means is this one is with the attack, this one's without the attack. The one with the attack, that fight was just going to last a shorter amount of time, right? But if you look at the report, it literally looks the exact same. Okay, even though if you look at the turn by turn, the damage is different, but the report looks the exact same. I didn't post it on here, but then I actually switched it to a defensive token, defense token 5%. And when you compare the 5% defense boost with the baseline that I started with, both sides actually took more 7 wounds than the baseline. And obviously with attack, the baseline didn't change. And the reason why is because defense doesn't scale with troop count. So as the troop count gets lower and lower, the defense will actually play a bigger factor. And the more time you spend at a lower troop count, you're actually taking more 7 wounds. And I'll actually get into that later. Whereas attack doesn't have that effect, at least for the 5%, right? So this one I'm pretty confident that attack by itself, which also boosts your normal attack and counterattack, doesn't actually directly affect the 7 wound percentage as far as like that factor with that multiplier that determines that. All right, third one is that because attack and counterattack deals more 7 wounds, then skill damage, especially like big skill damage, actually deals less 7 wounds. This one, again, these are my farms. It's just actually really hard to find conditions where you have 2 sides that are the exact same. And I'm in KVK right now, so we also have different crystal tech, so it was just hard. But my solution for that is I had a markswoman. When I started, they were both level 1, so no skills. Put an attack token on them. They both have an attack token on them. And then their active skill, the first one, they were both at 4, right? So you can see on this first side, when they launched their active skill on turn 11, they did 51 damage apiece. and that upgraded both of those to level 5 for their first skill. And you can see on the turn 11 for the active skill, it was 53 damage apiece. Turn 1 through 10 before that on both sides the same, just because the only thing that changes is the active skill. So until they launch the active skill, nothing changes, right? So you would think if the active skill is doing more damage, it should show up on the sev wounds in some way, but the report was actually exactly the same. It was 1,000 units, 128 sev wounds, 872. There wasn't much of a change there. I'm not very confident just because that boost in damage was very small, right? So, and I don't have a way of testing a bigger damage. So I do need more testing, but my gut feeling, especially as I came across other stuff later on, is that skill damage doesn't actually directly affect the sev wound percentage either. Okay. So then as I was doing testing, and then I found about the health bar, the percentage relative to the health bar. When that became debunked really like early on in the testing, I actually didn't know where to go. So I just had to make some observations, right? So the first one was that when you start with the same amount of troops in the same conditions, right? So all these stats are the same. The lower the amount of troops you start with, the higher the sev wound percentage. Right, so you can see this one with 1,000 units, it was 128 sev wounds, or 12.8% of the units actually took sev wounds. When I dropped that number to 500, that sev wound percentage went to 13.6%, and then when I dropped it to 300, it went to 15.3%. And it's logical to assume that if I dropped that down to 100 or 50, the sev wound percentage would be higher, right? Also, just I didn't test this, and this is, don't use this one if you don't want to, but I went online just to find like a crazy report that's super high, and it's from a rally garrison, because that's the only way you could get into a lot more units, right? And for this one, even though the sev wound looks really impressive, there's 92 million here, and I stole this from like an OmniArc video, so credit to wherever he got that report. I think it's actually from his kingdom. But when you take the sev wounds as a percentage of the total damage take, right? So sev wounds and slightly wounded, it actually only comes out to 6.3%. And that kind of tracks with this, right? As the amount of troops involved gets higher and higher, the sev wound percentage goes lower. Even though you're taking more sev wounds, the sev wounds, or the percentage of sev wounds as a part of the total damage taken actually gets lower and lower. I think that's done to scale down how many sev wounds. So like, because if you take something like this and the sev wound percentage is 3 times as much, I think people's hospitals will just overflow and fill too quick. So there's a scaling option where as it gets higher and higher, the sev wound percentage gets lower, and then as the troop count gets lower and lower, the sev wound percentage actually gets higher. Right, and that's the observation I had with number 1. So observation number 2 that I noticed is that the bigger the difference in the troop count ratio, the higher the sev wound percentage actually scales up for both sides. So this is another quote unquote catch-up mechanism or scaling mechanic, right? If I just ask you off the top of your head, I'm like, hey, if someone has 8 times the amount of troops you have, and you guys fight each other, it would be logical that you would have somewhere about 8 times as many sev wounds, right? But the scaling mechanism actually makes that number a little bit closer, and I'll go over it here. So on the top row, first one I have 8,000 to 1,000, right? So 8 to 1, and then 3,000 to 1,000, and then a 3 to 1, and then 2 to 1,000, that's a 2 to 1, right? So you can see the sev wound percentage here is really, really high. It's 36%, so 36.09%. For the 8,000 side compared to 40.2% for the 1,000 side, right? Or you want to do the ratio, it's 0.89 or about like 89.77% of the ratio. This number is way higher. Let's actually go to the previous slide compared to this, right? So if you look at just, they were trading equal. The closer the troop count is, actually the lower the sev wound percentages on both sides. And then as you raise the difference, the percentage both sides takes actually goes up, but the huge advantage actually still goes to the side with more troops, just because they're doing, I mean, this is just napkin math, right? Like, it's actually not 1-for-1 like this, but they're doing 8 times as much damage every turn. So even though the percentage is almost as high, it's just scaling this down a little bit, but the percentage is still massively on the side that has more troops. Now you can see when I go to the second graph here, now it's 3-to-1, 3,000 to 1,000. This 7 percentage drops significantly, right? 36% to 24.6%, 40% to 26.5%. And the ratio now raises to 92.83%. So basically, the 7 percentage starts getting closer. So when the differential is higher, the 7 percentage difference is actually also higher. And as the troop differential gets lower and lower, these two numbers as a percentage of each other actually get closer and closer. That's not necessarily too important, but it's just to show, like, again, there is a scaling mechanism. The most important thing is to notice almost like the bracket, right? 8-to-1, 3-to-1, and then 2-to-1, how that number actually jumps, right? So if you just look at here, right, from 2-to-1 to 3-to-1, right, it's jumping up a few percentage points, whereas from like 3-to-1 to 8-to-1, you're jumping up like 12% on the winning side, and then you're jumping up 14%, 7 percentage on the losing side. Now, something weird happens, right? Because when I bring it down to 100 units and 800 units, so this is 8-to-1, this is 3-to-1, you can see the trend. You know, if I did a 2-to-1, it'll be the same. The 7 percentage is actually still really high, right? But all of a sudden, the winning side actually takes a lot higher 7s. And the best way I could chalk that up to is it's some kind of like unknown, like catch-up or scaling mechanic. It's really hard to figure out. But if you compare them to each other, right? So don't compare the bottom to the top. If you compare 8-to-1, 3-to-1, you can still see the 8-to-1 is trading a lot higher than the 3-to-1. And then that ratio also starts getting lower and lower, or starts scaling more towards being equal as you get lower and lower as far as the troop count differential. Okay, so the conclusion for all this is that there is some kind of unknown or catch-up or scaling mechanic, which is why it's hard to give an exact percentage of when you should probably like pull your troops back. But in general, the bigger picture is that the bigger the differential, the ratio in troop count, the higher the 7 percentage. And this is going to come into play when I draw my real conclusion later on. Okay, so having said all that, this is how I think 7s work. Okay, so there's 3 parts. The first part is that every turn there's a 7s factor, which I think some kind of multiplier, and it's some kind of formula that Lilith hasn't released. And that's determined by the ratio of the troop count of the 2 fighting marches, right? So I showed the 8-to-1 or 3-to-1. That ratio actually will be determined by how close or how different it is, right? So if it's like almost a 1-to-1, it's gonna be really low. If it's 8-to-1, it's gonna be really high on both sides. And the higher that the difference in the ratio, the higher the 7 percentage scales. Number 2, every turn there's actually a second factor, right? So the second factor or multiplier is actually on every turn. It's determined by how many troops, literally how many troops each side has, right? The higher the troop, the lower that 7 percentage is going to be. And then as the troop count gets lower and lower on every turn, the higher that 7 percentage is going to be. And then the third one is really the least important one, but since I covered it a little bit, I'll talk about it more. There is some kind of scaling mechanic where the 7s don't scale proportionally, right? So basically, if one side has 3 times as many troops as the other, they don't actually deal 3 times as many 7s. The scaling mechanic tends to make that a little bit closer. So the way 7 works is, one, there's just, again, your commanders, equipment, armaments, your technology, just how you're playing on the field, how you're trading, right? That contributes into a damage taken on one side and the damage taken on the other side. And then this factor A, B, and C, it actually factors into, I think it's like a multiple. So you'll take whatever is spit out by this first formula, right? And then there's going to be a percentage of that. What percentage of that is going to be wounded, and what percentage of that is going to be slightly wounded. And then that is determined by essentially A times B times C, right? So you get the raw data of the two sides fighting, and then you'll multiply that A times B times C to determine what percentage that damage turns into sev wounds. So in conclusion, this is actually the last slide, there's a few more. But in conclusion, the most important factor by itself is actually the troop count differential, right? You can see how when it went to 8-1, that sev wound percentage went through the roof, and as you get lower and lower, or closer to each other, then that percentage gets a lot lower, right? The higher the difference in the ratio, the more the sev wound percentage goes up, and it's not non-linearly. So it's not going up in a straight line. It's actually more like a parabola, right? So as it gets higher and higher, it will actually exponentially get higher and higher. The second most important factor by itself is the amount of troops remaining, right? The lower amount of troops you have at the start of every turn, the higher that sev wound percentage is going to be. However, this is where the two are synergistic and interact with each other. As a troop count gets lower, so think like if you're fighting someone, their health bar gets into red, so they have a low troop count, right? That's when you could get these crazy ratios, right? So if someone had 50,000 and I have 200,000 troops, that's a 4-to-1 ratio, right? But if they have like just a full usual like 200 or 210,000 non-crystal tech, non-KVK troop count, there's no way I could get a 4-to-1 ratio on them because I will need 800,000 troops. So that's why as someone gets lower and lower, the first factor actually benefits from the troop getting lower, and these two are actually synergistic and interact with each other. Okay, and then just I'll reiterate this again. Yes, your commanders, your technology, equipment, armaments, and even how many troops you have still matters. In this case, how many troops you have determines how much damage you do, right? Like it scales off of your attack. Okay, the combination of this 5 is actually what determines what the sev wound percentage is based off of anyways. So if your commanders suck, even if you have a bunch of troops, you still have crappy commanders. So you still got to work on all the stuff you've been working on. It's just kind of a way to neatly package how the sev wounds percentage and everything works together. Okay, so let's actually explain Attilla Takeda or Attila Nevsky in a little bit, right? Because right now we know you see a lot of rallies, people want to launch Attila Nevsky, and the idea is that it's going to farm kills, and it does work. So this is actually why it works. It's not because of the high attack and counterattack. Let's actually go over scenario 1. So in scenario 1, right, an Attila rally has a high troop count ratio relative to the field marches, right? So when you're launching, depending on what you're attacking and what your technology is, right? You should have at least 2 million, let's just say 2 million troops. And on the field, at most, you're going to have 400,000, right? So if you have 2 million, they have 400,000, that's a 5-to-1, right? When you get swarmed and you're trading at that 5-to-1 ratio, that sev wound percentage is going to be really high. And then you add in the high attack and counterattack, so you're not waiting for a active skill to proc off. It is literally just every turn that's happening. You're getting a high sev wound percentage because of the troop count difference. Okay, the more people that are swarming you when you have a high attack and counterattack, the more people that you're going to get that benefit from. Okay, so Attila as a rally really shines when it gets swarmed. If it's not getting swarmed, it's not actually farming a lot of kills, unless you're actually fighting against a weaker city garrison. The reason why is because if you're stronger than the garrison, especially the city garrison, where they can't constantly get reinforced to get their troop count up, then as the troop count of the garrison gets lower and lower, right, and then it's not putting out that big skill damage. You're essentially getting a lot more turns when the enemy's troop is getting lower and lower. And then when they get lower enough to a certain point and you're winning because they're a weaker city garrison, then you're getting the benefit of, one, the troop count per turn is lower, right, at the start of every turn. But then also you're getting the benefit of this that first factor I talked about, where that differential and ratio is getting bigger and bigger. And that's actually when he's farming most of his Sev wounds. Okay, and then third, finally, on the field, right, back in the day when Attilla Takeda was just the best, right, it's just a better March, so it's actually just doing more damage than anyone else, right? But now on the field, he's actually only good at farming kills against weaker marches. Kind of the same idea here, right? Because if you're finding a march that has a high skill damage, right, they're just nuking you down. You're going to drop your troop relative to the enemy so quick that it doesn't matter how high your attack or counterattack is. You're actually not going to be doing that well, right? Now, there's an exception to that, is when Attilla and let's just say Attilla Takeda is getting surrounded on the field, right? Because it's not necessarily that viable of a march now, but when you're getting surrounded, you have to realize, even when your troop count gets lower, right? So let's just say Attilla Takeda is losing, right? And then everyone else that's surrounding you is 3 or 4x more troops than you. Remember, when your troop ratio differential is high, it actually scales the Sev wounded percentage for both sides. So even when he's getting surrounded and he's going down fast, as he's going down, he's going to trade really well as far as Sev wounds, because that percentage is going to scale up really high, and the attack and counterattack will allow him to actually get better trades relative to each march that's surrounding him, as compared to a march that has like high skill damage but can hit at most like 5 targets. Whereas like if you get Attilla Takeda surrounded by 12 targets, you'll actually be able to farm more Sev wounds that way. So hopefully that kind of clarifies Attilla in a way where you kind of understand why he's working the way he's working, and it's not just because attack and counterattack is good for Sev wounds. It kind of is, but like there's context to it. All right. Next one is where I think this health as a percentage theory came from. And before I cover this slide, I just want to say, like, if you watch my, I think, last video or the one before, like nothing but respect for Wick Gaming, what he was able to figure out and do, and just looking at some of his old videos, it's incredible. Okay, but I actually think he's the one that kind of started this misperception. So the video in question is, you could go look it up. Posted it 2+ years ago. It's our tier 4 better than tier 5, right? And in the video, he actually posted this little graph down here. And what he did was he ran T4 against T5, right? Counted for all the conditions. And then he would pull the march back every 5%. So he would run T4 and T5, and then he'll pull it back at about 90%, then run out a new march, pull it back at about 90%, run a new march, try to pull it back at about 85%. And then what he was tracking was the amount of Sev wounds that his T4 took versus the enemy who was fighting against the T5, and he charted it as a ratio, right? And then what he found was, if you plug it into the X and Y axis, you start getting kind of like this graph, right? And at 50%, that's when you can see this graph starts going down faster. And then from 50 to 20, it's noticeably more steep than the first part. And then as you get below 20, this number just goes down faster and faster and faster, right? And the way he presented it was that as a percentage, and he even has it labeled like green, yellow, red, which corresponds to the health bar. The way he presented it is, you want to pull your troop back by 50%, because that's when you're the most effective, right? But what this graph actually shows isn't the health percentage. You already debunked that on one of the first slides. What it's actually showing is he has a certain amount of troops back, but then it's also relative to how many troops the enemy has, right? And he doesn't show it on this graph, so we don't actually know. I don't even know if he has this spreadsheet with him. But what this is actually showing isn't health, right? Like the percentage of health where you lose your effectiveness, it's actually how many troops you had remaining versus how many troops the enemy had remaining, and it's T4 versus T5, right? So different stats, and then at that percentage with whatever the differential and troop count is, that's when the effectiveness goes down. So it's actually a cool chart, and the idea is there, but it actually is not supposed to be scaled off of health percentage, and I think this is where it came from, and it just kind of grew and grew, and then now people just think, oh, a yellow, you take more damage. That's not true. For example, if I started out with 430,000 troops and I got down to 50%, so that's 215,000 troops, right? So I'm in the yellow 50%, and I ran into someone with just 200,000 troops, right? And they're 100% full, completely green. I actually have more troops than that person, and based off of the testing and everything I've done, I'll actually have an advantage in 7 percentage, even though my march is in yellow and his is in complete green. Okay, so this I'm pretty confident is dead as far as that health and percentage. That's like one of the easiest things to test, and maybe it's the way he was communicated, because he actually said in another video that wounds is a factor of health, the delta between your health. So I think he actually knew this. At least he knew the general idea where this was going. But I think that's where it came from. And this idea of if your health is in yellow, if your health is in red, that's actually not exactly what it is. Okay, so finally, some practical applications that you could take away from this. First, if you can, and you should be able to do it, always use a 50% troop expansion, right? Because if you remember earlier, the more troops you have, the lower the 7 percentage you're going to take, okay? And especially as you get later into KVK, where the top players are reaching max tech, so they're able to get 430 to 450 thousand troops. If you don't use a 50% troop expansion, let's just say you walk out there, no expansion with 260K, and they have 450, right? You can be completely green, and you'll start taking a lot of 7s right away. So one, you want to get good commanders, equipment, armaments, all that, but you actually don't want to be at such a huge disadvantage in troop count. Because that's actually when you're taking a lot of the 7s, right? The second one is the best reason to sad face is so you can refresh faster. Oh, it doesn't mean you're tougher, you're finding it out, all that stuff. Because when your troop gets lower, right, the only benefit you're actually providing on the field when you get low is that you're maybe buffing some of your teammates or you, and you're maybe providing some debuffs, but you're dealing almost no damage, because damage scales off of troop capacity or troop count. And if your troops are low, then you're doing almost no damage anyways. And when your troops are low, that differential is just causing you to give a lot of free 7s. So there's actually very few scenarios I can think of where it's actually worth it a sad face. Most of the time, you should just refresh. Like the only exception is maybe when it's like first starting, and your city is very, very far from the front line. So if you try to march back to your city with like a half health troop and then back, that time differential might not be worth it. But if you can, you should not sad face. There's very little benefit, and it just like, I think it's pretty clear. I don't know where the culture came from, but based on the data and how you're actually benefiting yourself and your kingdom, I don't think sticking it out and sad facing is really actually that beneficial. Number 3, don't swarm rallies unless it's mission critical, right? Just inherently because of the troop differential and the 7 percentage, if you swarm rallies, you're going to take a lot of 7s just because it heavily favors the side that has a lot more troops, especially when it's multiples of what you have. Okay, and then number 4, the field meta actually favors lower set wounds, right? So right now, the field meta is you want to do big AoE skill damage or Lucha smite damage, and when you do that, when you do a massive amount of damage at once, you don't get a lot of little hits when the enemy is low, right? You just want to drop them really low and get them off the field. And when that actually happens, less sev wounds are going to happen. So in a way, trying to farm more sev wounds actually is counter to what the field meta is right now. Now there is an alternative, kind of. I think Luce offers the best of both worlds, because Luce has a 5-target big AoE damage, right? But his expertise actually gives you a bonus attack, right? And when you get extra bonus attacks and really like small instant procs, increases the chance of you to get more hits than when the target is low, and that actually increases the chances of you hitting the enemy when there's that big troop count differential before you just half face them. And that's probably the best way to still be part of the meta, but farm some extra sebs. So Luce, I mean, I think anyone who's used Luce, especially with Scipio and even Alex or Gorgo, that I think he's the best commander of the game as far as trading, and he just carries almost any March he's with, and that's the reason why. Right. I think that is actually it. Hopefully there's a lot of comments, and I'm sure people will question some of the stuff I'm talking about. Looking forward to interacting with you guys. This video probably took me 20 plus hours to make, and then a lot of thinking. There's a lot of stuff I didn't post in here just because a lot of the tests ended up not being relevant or even thinking of what to test. So yeah, you know, if you got some value from this, please like and subscribe. And thank you for appreciating or supporting the channel. Looking forward to hearing from you guys, and I'll talk to you guys next time.